Hi, everybody. Welcome. And thank you for tuning in for a conversation on the history of drug war, colonialism, and racial justice. So my name is Kwasi Adusei. I'm based out of Buffalo, New York. One of the founders of the Psychedelic Society of Western New York. I'm also a trainee of the MAPS MDMA-assisted psychotherapy program and was in the first cohort of trainees of color. So shout out to any of my fellow trainees who are in here. I also want to say thank you to Mike, who through Psychedelic Seminars is giving us a platform for this really important conversation. So today I'm going to be wearing the hat of moderator for this conversation, along with some amazing members of this talk. And so first I want to start with a land acknowledgement, as I'm currently on the lands of the Haudenosaunee. And I invite all of you guys to also consider the lands that you're on. In doing so, I want you to consider your relationship to the land, and I think that acknowledging the land that you're on isn't enough. I mean, it's important that some of these gestures are followed with really serious consideration of how we're treating the land that we're inhabiting. So the reason that we're here is because so much historical pain and trauma have really come to a head in the last few weeks. And so yesterday was Juneteenth, which is a holiday celebrating the emancipation of the slaves that many of us until this year weren't aware was even a holiday. So Martin Luther King once said that justice too long delayed is justice denied. And with the recent deaths in the Black community, people are really waking up to these injustices and rising up in mass to learn, to feel, and to act. And say that the more education that somebody has, the more empathy that they develop, and the more empathy that they have, the more action that they're called to. And so I want to thank all of you for being here, not only for the cognitive intentions of learning more, but with the somatic intentions to feel. It's through our relationship with our bodies that we're going to be able to move through collective trauma and truly move towards healing. And so join with me here are Camille, Barton, we've got Neill Franklin, Mohawk, Greene, and I'll allow all of them to introduce themselves. And we'll start with Camille.
Thanks, Kwasi. My name's Camille Barton. I'm a writer, artist, and somatic educator working on the intersections of wellness, drug policy, and transformative justice. I've been running an organization called the Collective Liberation Project, sort of exploring embodied approaches to anti-racism work and collective liberation.
Thank you so much, Camille. Next, Neill, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Neill Franklin, retired 34-year police veteran from the state of Maryland. Hello to all my Baltimore friends out there. I see there's some from Baltimore. So as the executive director of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, where I've been for 10 years now, we're a collection of criminal justice professionals trying to not so much reform our criminal justice policies, because that just means they look different and will probably still have the same harms. We are about solving problems. So unfortunately, we're in this time that Kwasi mentioned, and we're busy. We're busy, and we can't let this opportunity escape us. So I want to thank everyone for tuning in to this, and I think we're all going to learn something in this episode and in future episodes. And let me just end with this. I think that the psychedelic community is one of the most thoughtful and compassionate communities that I've ever come in contact with. So it is my honor to be a part of this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neill, and it's our honor to have you here with us. And Mohawk?
Hi, everyone. My name is Mohawk Greene. I'm a drug and harm reduction educator based in Brooklyn, New York. I've done a lot of work with Dance Safe, as well as am the president of New York Dance Safe, this local chapter. I'm also a technical director with Nextistro, which is an online platform for basically an online syringe exchange. So you're able to receive a number of really anything you can receive from a syringe exchange, naloxone, needles, things of that nature, all online, delivered to you for free. And it's a really great resource for people who are just now hearing about it for the first time. But I've been involved in doing harm reduction for the last 6 years now. So yeah, that's basically it for me. And I've also done a lot of work with other harm reduction organizations across the globe. So I'm here to give a little bit of my perspective as well.
Thank you so much, Mohawk. And so what you guys are gonna see today is, a collection of experiences and knowledge from the folks in this panel. We're gonna be having a conversation. We invite you to ask some questions as we're going along with the program. And then following that, we're gonna be able to answer some of those questions for you in the last half hour or so. And so before we get started, Camille is gonna lead us through a really beautiful grounding. And so Camille.
So I think it's always useful when talking about oppression or race or colonization to notice what's happening in the body, because a lot of activism in the Western context is really focused on reading and cerebral engagement. But there's a lot happening in our bodies as well in terms of sensation, discomfort, restriction that can come sometimes when we're having these conversations, which are not necessarily so commonplace. So throughout the session, I'd really invite everyone to just stay aware of what's happening in your body. Try and stay with your breath and just notice if there's areas the conversation goes to that feel a little bit uncomfortable. Just really track that for yourself, because I think there's a lot of insights that can come from that. So I'm going to lead us into a little grounding to hopefully get us a bit more connected with the body. And then the invitation is to stay present with that as we go through the material. So to begin with, I just invite you to start looking around your space, wherever you are, really allowing your neck to move, your eyes to really be curious about your space. And as you're looking and taking things in, just notice any colors that stand out to you, any objects that bring you joy or you feel connected to. Staying with your breath, noticing any smells in your space. Noticing the sensation of your clothing against your skin. And then coming to find some stillness. And invite you to close your eyes if that feels good. Or you can look down or just rest your gaze somewhere in your space. And just take a few deep breaths into your body, if that feels available to you. Being aware of any sensations arising in your body right now. As you breathe in, I invite you to try and draw in energy, associations of people or things in your life that resource you, that allow you to feel nourished and grounded. If it's a particular person or a place, you might like to just visualize this being or place as you breathe in, and just notice any sensations in your body as you focus on this feeling of being resourced. And as you exhale now, I'd invite you to visualize releasing any insecurities or anxiety around this conversation that you might be bringing with you in this moment. You might like to imagine this trickling through your body, down through your feet, into the earth below. And then finally, I'd invite you to connect with your body in some way. This might be putting a hand on your chest or on your tummy. And just sending yourself a little bit of gratitude for showing up for this conversation, for staying with your body and being receptive and curious about what emerges. And when you're ready, feel free to open your eyes, maybe have a little wiggle if you need to, get back into the space. And yeah, I guess we will begin. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Camille. I feel so much in my body just loosening up. When we talk about a lot of these things that are going on, it is wise that we talk about its context with our experience in our bodies. And so this context stems way back to colonialism, but even further than that. We often talk about the trauma that racial populations have, but white people have trauma too. You think about the Middle Ages and the plague, right? And so this is trauma that we're all holding in our bodies. And I want to kind of start this conversation with history, right? Talking about colonialism, how we got here today. And we have a great international audience right now. Looks like we have people all over the world. And so, Camille, I want to ask you first, what's your experience been like witnessing all of this, being in the land of, the colonizer, quote unquote, right? And just your experience as a person of color with intersectionality. I just want to hear about your experience with this.
Thank you. So what I forgot to mention in my introduction is that I'm currently based in Berlin, but I grew up in the UK, in London. I'm definitely of the African diaspora. I have both Nigerian and Caribbean heritage, and also English or Celtic heritage as well. So for me, colonization has really viscerally impacted my family in lots of different ways. My grandmother was born in colonial Guyana in Georgetown in the 1930s. And hearing her stories and the socialization that she had of, on the one hand, being told that, they were part of the Queen's England and that they were subjects of the UK, and they were kind of taught to be quite proud of this. And yet, in many ways, they were still part of a deep system of racial hierarchy and extraction, where resource was being extracted, where my grandmother's traditional practices and rituals of our people were severed and cut off in service of learning Queen's English and ascribing to Western forms of education. And there's a lot of wounding from that still. And equally, in my Nigerian heritage, my people over there are Yoruba, and it's a similar thing. Nigeria and much of the African continent was heavily colonized, and in a way is still involved in lots of legacies from this time of extraction that hasn't really shifted when we think of economic systems and the way they've been structured through the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank with structural readjustment programs. This has very much kept the African continent and many other parts of the world really embedded in these cycles of wealth extraction from the global south to the global north. And part of that is facilitated also by the sort of colonization of the mind, I suppose, that has happened, where colonialism has taken shape in people of different countries and places no longer feeling our inherent value as people because of being kind of violently forced into systems where we no longer have our languages necessarily, our traditional ways of practicing our religions or connecting with our ancestors. And many of these practices were grounded with plant medicine usage or with entheogens. So there's a big kind of wounding that's taken place, and still a lot of the same exploitation and those dynamics really feeding into where we are today. So yeah, for me, colonization connects on many different intersectional levels, not just with racism and white supremacy, but also with human supremacy and the kind of domination over nature and other animals and beings that we share this planet with. Also patriarchy, ableism, All of these things have kind of emanated from the colonial project. So I think for people who are interested in anti-oppression work and transformative justice, it's really useful to understand these processes that were taking place and the legacies that continue to live on now that we are experiencing. And I think in the context of drug policy, this is very, very visible and obvious to us, even in the way that we talk about psychedelics, for example. We talk about the psychedelic revolution as if this just started in the 1960s, and often do not acknowledge the indigenous usage and knowledge holding of plant medicines for however many thousands and thousands of years. So yeah, I'm definitely excited to kind of get into these different facets and connect some of the dots, because it is a very complex and intertwined area that I'm still learning huge amounts about. But I hope that we can sort of connect the dots enough so that there's a little bit of a map that people can hold to understand how these things really connect, so that we can start to repair some of the harms from this past 400, 500 years.
Thank you so much, Camille. You know, something that I kind of wanted to dive in a little bit further was about this colonial dynamic with psychedelic history. Would you mind expanding more on that?
Sure. Where to begin? I mean, I suppose I've just mentioned, even the way that we frame this movement is really rooted from a kind of Western, mostly USA-based perspective for what is now currently known as the United States of America, whilst kind of invisibilizing indigenous use and the protection and kind of this knowledge and these knowledge systems. I think that it's important to understand that with colonization came prohibition for many people. So again, if I bring this to my personal ancestry, in the Nigerian context, the Yoruba context, with colonization did not just come violence and subjugation and extraction of resources and violence against bodies, enforced religion, but also prohibition of using plant medicines, which were used for healing, but also for connecting with ancestors, the prohibition also of religious rituals. So there has been a direct severing there in various cultural contexts that I think is important to acknowledge, because now in more recent times, we see that it's the descendants of people in the diaspora, but also other indigenous communities, and people from parts of the global south or had ancestry in the global south who've really been targeted and harmed most by the war on drugs. So what started off as initially a separation from traditional medicine and plants zoomed forward to the United States in the early 20th century, where you had indentured laborers from China who'd come over to build the railroads. This is really wonderfully documented by, just wrote his name down somewhere. In The House I Live In, there's a historian who speaks to this. If you are interested in watching that documentary, it cites this quite well. But at the time, these indentured laborers from China were using opium quite frequently. Opium was legal, heroin was legal at this time. And elites in power in the United States wanted to find a way to criminalize the indentured laborers, and they couldn't ostensibly do this because they were Chinese. So what they ended up doing is criminalizing opium. And then suddenly there was a way to imprison huge amounts of this new kind of migrant population. We see the same thing happen with Latino communities, with the association of marijuana, sort of a few decades on from that. And we then again see a similar trend with the association of crack cocaine and African American communities. So what's really well documented by a number of theorists, including this wonderful historian in The House I Live In, whose name I cannot remember right now, is that drug prohibition and policies have really been very much tied to racial and social control. They've rarely been about the drugs themselves. It's mainly been something that's been weaponized against specific ethnic groups and communities. How does this relate to colonization? Well, if we see that there's been that initial trauma of separation and suppression in order to extract resource. And then you have descendants of those communities who come again to have economic mobility and agency. And we see that criminalization coming through use of plants is what's being used to suppress those groups. I think there is a strong argument to really think about the need to repair harms to communities that have continued to be impacted by prohibitionist policies. And when it comes to indigenous communities, First Nation communities in the United States of America, there's also a lot of nuance and attention that needs to be given to conservation at this moment, or overconsumption from Westerners and how this impacts a lot of these communities. So when we think about peyote, it's at the moment in a state of endangerment, and it's potentially, unless things really shift, it may not be accessible for the communities who traditionally work with this medicine to actually use it anymore. And this medicine is inherently tied into being able to connect with ancestors and connect to their spiritual practices. So we need to think about reciprocity as the psychedelic community. You know, what does it mean to show reciprocity and care to indigenous communities that have been the medicine holders and have a direct cultural relationship with specific plants? What does it mean to really be in solidarity with them and to think about their needs to exist and actually have their worldview being able to be maintained? But with the levels of tourism that we see and the lack of consciousness around this dynamic, I think there is a still quite colonial, extractive practice that's happening. Like, okay, we'll go in and have this spiritual experience and take this, but not care about the people whose medicine this is and whose culture this is, and cultural heritage that we're potentially encroaching on for not having a sensitive and holistic approach, caring approach to working with medicine. So yeah, I think colonialism is definitely a historical event, but lives on in our actions and our bodies and the ways that we often as Westerners feel entitled to take from other communities without having reciprocity. And I think this is something that desperately needs to shift if we are going to have a more equitable world and to actually shape drug policy in a way that benefits people who have been harmed by legacies of colonization and disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs and the incarceration and destruction of families that this has created over the last 60, 70 years. I'll pause there for now.
No, you're a wealth of knowledge, and there's so much there. A lot that I'd like to dive into a little bit later on. But right now, some of the things that I kind of want to pull from what you were speaking on were about some of how this colonialism has transitioned over into this sort of a war on drugs here in the West, and how that's affected populations here. Not just in America. I know that, what they say, America has 1% of the world's population, 25% of the world's prison population, right? And so it's a problem, huge problem here in America, but I know it's an issue elsewhere also. And so I kind of want to transition over to you, Neill, because you've got deep experience with the Baltimore Police Department. So would you mind telling me a little bit about your experience and perhaps how you transitioned from the work that you were doing into the work that you're doing now?
Yeah, sure. I want to touch a little bit on what some of the things that Camille was saying, because I'm getting an education here. Some of what she has spoken to, I have learned, but I didn't learn any of this while I was in policing. And that's a problem. That's a big problem. I think if most police officers would learn the history surrounding drugs, colonialization, coming forward, even just the history in this country alone, going back a century or so, I think that things would be dramatically different. So in my 34 years of policing, I learned absolutely nothing other than the birth of the Drug Enforcement Administration, if you want to call that history, and that wasn't accurate at all. But I learned absolutely nothing about what Camille was saying regarding, the persecution of the Chinese, because, they used opium. It was part of their culture, and they could not, it wasn't right to criminalize Chinese for being Chinese, but we could go after them for what they do. And, so since I've been doing this work, and it was violence, it was experiencing too much of the violence in policing that brought me to this place, because I was able to connect the dots of the illicit drug trade and violence. So just understand, the violence that we experience in our communities doesn't come from drug use. It comes from the policies. It comes from the public policy of drug prohibition, which is about what Camille was talking about. And from what I continue to learn, and listening to Camille, what I continue to learn is that that's part of the strategy when it comes to indigenous people and the medicines that they use or used to use, right? A strategy to separate people from their culture, right? If you want to control them, if you want to keep them subservient, you separate them from their culture, you separate them from their traditions, you separate them from their heritage, and then it becomes a lot easier. And what Camille was talking about in this country regarding the control of our Mexican and Latino brothers and sisters from the South, controlling Blacks in the last century, Harry Anslinger, who we consider the nation's pretty much first drug czar. He was in charge of the Bureau of Narcotics back in the 1930s. He was the one leading the charge, so he was the one creating the narrative around Black folks, around Hispanics, around Latinos. He was the one creating that narrative of fear for whites in America, right? You have to fear these people, connecting it to their drug use, and then he's able to pass these laws of prohibition that then we exported to the rest of the world. But I just wanted to say that I continue to learn. I continue to learn the history surrounding this. So Camille, thank you for what you've, and I know I'm going to learn a lot more, but thank you for what you have just spoken to. It's this history and the continued learning of this history that has moved me from 3 decades of persecuting people under these policies of drug prohibition. It is that learning of this history that's quickly moved me to this place of doing whatever I can do to change, to remedy, it's almost like an atonement, if you might say, right? I'm gonna stick a pin in it right there and just pause. And there's a whole lot more to how I got to this place now, but in summation, that's kind of like it. It's really learning about the truth of drug policies and colonialization and the persecution of indigenous populations and certain groups of people through drug policy. It's a significant tool in making that happen.
Thank you, Neill. And so Mohawk, the work that you're doing out in New York City it's a lot of it's related to harm reduction, correct? How would you say some of these drug policies that we're talking about have affected the work that you're doing?
Well, as far as it goes with the specific type of harm reduction that DanceSafe does, which is centered around nightlife, communities, festivals, things of that nature, people who may be using substances recreationally or not specifically in like a clinical or medicinal or, spiritual context. A lot of people enjoy using substances. So prohibition has basically just catalyzed the number of issues that we see with people's, drug use. Like, it creates problematic drug use because people are not informed on how to use these substances. They don't always understand what these substances do. And, here in the US, we have the RAVE Act, which is this very lovely piece of legislation that was ushered through in the most sneaky way possible by Joe Biden, that basically will try to penalize any venues that would offer anything that looks like harm reduction to people who are using substances. So this RAVE Act basically was like an extension of these crack house laws, where they don't want people using drugs in a space, period. And if they are able to basically try to pin venue owners or people who own a space with condoning or promoting drug use, and they could try to enact that additional expansion of the law, which was ironically ushered in through the Amber Alert bill. So it was extremely sneaky, but it's there, and it puts a lot of pressure on recreational spaces, entertainment spaces, to feel like they need to basically police people's substance use, not have water available for people, not really have areas for people to calm down or relax or, get their grounding back. It's definitely exacerbated the issue with creating unsafe spaces for people to experiment with drugs. And for a lot of people, that tends to happen in these recreational contexts. And that's pretty specific to the US, but it also prevents us from doing drug checking. And because of having, drugs outlawed, we have no idea what's in the product, if the product is what it's being sold as. So, a lot of people who might be trying to get a substance like LSD or MDMA, there's so many things that have been created to try to mimic those effects, or even just things that have been created just to pass off as a substance and might not be in any way related to that substance. And those things can cause additional health issues, mentally or physically. Not everything may result in death, but, I'm sure there's a lot of folks who may have experimented with psychedelics at some point, where if they got something that was way more potent than they anticipated, or it wasn't the same substance that they were anticipating, that they might have had some sort of traumatic experience or some sort of, negative side effects to using something that they just didn't have any idea what the makeup of it was or the quantity of it was. On top of generally having very little knowledge about the substance itself, unless they've done their own research. So it definitely, creates an environment where there's more problems. We experience more issues with the drug supply and with how people use substances, by having this outlawed.
Thank you, Mohawk. And I'm reading into the comments right now, and I'm seeing a lot about Biden. And, earlier we were talking a bit about how, sort of Nixon and Reagan are the ones that sort of started this war on drugs. But what we also know is that between 1990, I believe, and 2000, the prison population actually doubled, and that was mostly during a Democratic era. So I kind of want to pose this question to any of you three. Is this a bipartisan thing? Is this a Democratic issue? Is this a Republican issue? What is this? What's going on here?
Who is this question being posed to? Just the floor is open.
It's open. It's open.
It's open.
Neill looks ready.
So, it's a United States thing. What I'm seeing and what I've seen for the past 10 years in working on this, you hear that it is liberal folks who are pushing for the changes and the reforms overall, and that may be somewhat true. But I think you hit on an important part when you really look at this politically, when you look at the administrations since Nixon, right? Starting with Nixon and coming forward, whether you're a conservative, whether you're liberal, all of them have been responsible for furthering this drug war. And with that, as you said, comes the incarceration of so many people. They've all been ramping it up. They've all been using the let's get tough on crime rhetoric, and then attaching that to drug use, right? Mohawk, you hit something that is absolutely very important regarding what happens when you prohibit drugs, when you prohibit literally any commodity that people want to use. It becomes adulterated, it becomes far more dangerous. It's all about profit motive, not that it isn't when it's legal, but at least you have some controls over it, right? With regulation and so on. But when it's illegal, it's about making the dollar as quickly as you can by putting together whatever you can. And when law enforcement pushes back, when they step up and ramp up enforcement, things get even worse, right? It doesn't matter what political party you're from, left or right, as we've seen. So it's neither a conservative thing, it's neither a liberal thing. They all have caused significant problems for us. Now, going forward, as we look at who seems to be learning about these mistakes, quicker than others, I think it is the left. It is the liberals that are learning more and who seem to be more willing to rectify and to repair the mistakes of the past. But I'm telling you, it's still very problematic. Joe Biden is not our answer going forward. I mean, he's the answer for a number of things. I mean, we definitely have to make a change in the White House, no doubt about that. But when it comes to drug use, Joe Biden's not going to be our savior. I'm telling you that right now. I don't know what that means going forward. I don't know what that means next year. What I can tell you this, it means that we, the people, have to work twice as hard to solve this problem of drug prohibition. We're starting to see traction in the psychedelic world a lot faster than we are at, say, relative to opium, heroin, cocaine, meth. I think we're going to be able to move that along quicker because we're starting to realize the therapeutic use behind psychedelics. And I think that most people are for that and are willing to do the work and the research to further that along. But it really, in my mind, it really goes back to repairing what we did to indigenous populations by separating them from medicinal plants, things that have been part of their culture, as Camille, as you said, going back thousands and thousands of years. That's where I think we need to do some serious work and repair that. And especially regarding our brothers and sisters in the South, over in Africa and parts of Africa. But again, I'm still learning about that part of it. But it's, believe me, when it comes to politics, we got a lot of work to do, folks, because those folks that we elect and that end up in office, whether at the state and local and federal levels, to them, really, for the most part, generally speaking, it's really about getting into a position of power. It's about the votes that they get. They're literally trying to play a strategic game. If I say this, if I don't do this, if I don't say that, I'm going to get more votes and it's going to get me elected, right? How about just doing what's right for the people? And if you get elected, you get elected. If you don't, you don't.
I would love to jump in on a few things you said right there, Neill. Thank you for that. A few things came to mind. I often think about Bill Clinton being kind of one of the most damaging figures in a way for mass incarceration in the United States of America with the 3 strikes law. So really kind of having this tough on crime, zero tolerance approach that if you have 3 strikes on your record, then you have a mandatory minimum of a certain amount of time in prison. And along with this, you also had mandatory minimums for certain drugs that were completely disproportionate and unfair, just because they were associated with certain communities. An example in point is crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. Chemically, there isn't much of a difference to these drugs. Crack is just added baking soda and heat, and it crystallizes. They're the same drug, but powder cocaine is associated with white people, crack cocaine is associated with black people. And there used to be an 100-to-1 ratio in terms of sentencing between one being the gram of powder cocaine, very little time considerably, and 100 times the amount of sentencing time for the same for a gram of crack cocaine. Obama reformed this a little bit, so now it's 10-to-1, but it's still, there shouldn't be any disparity. So this really highlights the way that these drug policies and laws are racialized. But also, I agree with you, Neill, in the sense that the psychedelic community is a promising space to allow for decriminalization, legalization of certain substances. But I think we need to do a lot more to really understand the communities that have been harmed and how to create policy that then repair some of those harms. So, for example, African American communities in Baltimore, according to the Grady Trauma Project, have higher rates of post-traumatic stress disorder than most veterans returning from war in the United States of America. And considering that so much of the MDMA psychotherapy research is happening through MAPS and other organizations, I'm very honored to be working with them in some capacity. Over 80% of the study participants in MAP studies so far have been white. So there's not necessarily been a prioritization to even research the effects of these psychedelic healing modalities on communities that are vastly experiencing more trauma, even in our contemporary moment. And we see similar things with cannabis and the regulatory stuff that's emerging there. I learned a lot the other day watching Hassan Minhaj's Patriot Act episode. I think it's called The Legal Marijuana Industry is Rigged. And it just kind of shows how that industry is evolving to mean that the majority of people who can afford to get into the market or have the lobbying power to, get a seat at that table are generally white corporate entities. It's super, super difficult to get into that market if you're a person of color, and nigh on impossible if you have a criminal record. So mass incarceration is a system locking people away who might have just had personal possession of marijuana. Still people in states where cannabis is legal that are in prison for just having personal possession of maybe a joint or something. So there's a lot of disparity. So I think we have to be really clear as we shift towards decrim or legalization to really be aware of how the policies are enacted and whether they're going to repair those harms and actually allow for people who've been targeted by the war on drugs and mass incarceration to get into the market and actually economically benefit. And equally, with the psychedelic therapies that are developing, making sure that therapists and clinicians are trained to address racial trauma, are trained to not enact embodied microaggressions and cause more harm to participants they're working with. And I'm really glad to say there is movement around that within MAPS and within some other organizations, but we've got a long way to go. And I think as a psychedelic community, we need to be also working with our harm reduction allies and not having psychedelic exceptionalism and saying, these are the good drugs over here and these are the bad drugs. It doesn't help anything because it cuts out the conversation about the war on drugs and about prohibition and systemic inequality and the reason that people use drugs a lot of the time because of trauma or, want to use it to experience joy, and not having this kind of disparity, which actually stops us from working together and collaborating to really have a society where there's less harm and more access and awareness about how we can responsibly use substances and also heal using substances.
Thank you so much, Camille. And you're so right. And one of the things that kind of comes to mind is this idea of how we can heal using psychedelics, right? How we can heal these populations, but also keeping that mind, that idea of the psychedelic exceptionalism. And so one of the things that comes up for me when talking about...
Can I say something real quick?
Oh, yeah.
Just real quick when Camille's going. When you were talking about, good drugs, bad drugs, I think this is a very important point to reemphasize for the people viewing today, is that drugs are neither good or bad. I mean, you can't label a drug as good, you can't label a drug as bad. It's all about the policy that you put in place regarding that particular drug. And obviously we've chosen the worst one that you can ever imagine. That's prohibition. And the reason I think it's important that we say this, because when you look at the marijuana movement that you touched on, we heard this over and over and over again. No, we're talking about, legalizing marijuana. We're not talking about heroin. We're not talking about, MDMA. We're not talking about, we're talking about marijuana, not cocaine or any of that stuff, right? Those are bad drugs. No, we have to stay away from that narrative. The entire war on drugs, drug prohibition, it's the policy that is extremely extremely problematic for all of us. And so I just wanted to reemphasize that. Let's stay away from that, and let's talk about the policy, and let's talk about the things that we're going over here today. So thanks for bringing that up.
So Neill, actually, I kind of want to focus a little bit on that. We had a conversation some time ago, and you talked a little bit about some policy that was developing around menthol cigarettes.
Oh,
Is
yeah.
that something that you can dive into right now?
Here we go again. So this, again, the policy. So I think we know by now that people are going to smoke tobacco products. I mean, yes, hundreds of thousands of people every year just in this country alone die from tobacco-related illnesses. We know that, we get that. But over the past few decades, we've made some really good progress by educating people, by making it a little bit uncomfortable if you smoke cigarettes. You can't smoke in the house, you got to go outside in the backyard or wherever. Treatment, things to get people off of smoking cigarettes. So there are policies now that are being crafted and put in place. It began in California to ban the sale of menthol cigarettes. Now, in initially hearing that, you'll say, well, that's probably a good thing. It's going to help people kick the habit. They're not going to be available for people to buy at the local gas station, local convenience store. Yeah, it's probably a good thing. All right, but let's play this out. And this is what we failed to do. We make these emotional responses regarding policy and putting policy in place. That was the whole crack cocaine piece. It was emotionally driven in Congress back in the 1980s. Most people don't realize that for decades, the preferred cigarette in the Black community is a menthol cigarette. 80% of Black folks who smoke menthol cigarettes. Now, I'm in Baltimore, where most of the population here in Baltimore is Black. I'm gonna tell you right now, if you ban the sale of menthol cigarettes in Baltimore City, you're not going to reduce smoking in Baltimore City. Although I would like for that to happen, it's not going to happen. The problem with that is, just to the south of us is Virginia. People are going to drive down to Virginia, right across the state line, less than an hour away, load up with menthol cigarettes, and they're going to come back into the city and set up shop. We've already seen what can happen when someone calls the police on someone selling cigarettes in front of a store. His name is Eric Gardner, New York. When you prohibit a popular product, especially in a poor community of color, you drive it immediately underground. And when that happens, who's called in to do something about it? The police are. Now, people who are advocating for this policy are saying, well, wait, time out. We're not making it illegal to smoke or possess a menthol cigarette. Yeah, we get that. But when someone starts selling menthol cigarettes in front of a shop that can no longer sell them, right, attracting customers to them instead of the store owner's going to call City Hall. We've seen it time and time again. And the police are going to have to respond to find out who's smuggling cigarettes, menthol cigarettes, into Baltimore City. And a tactic that we use in policing, that we use during drug prohibition, is that if you want to find out who's smuggling something in, you go after the person who's using it. And although I cannot go after the person for possessing the product, I can sure stop them for jaywalking when I see that they're smoking cigarettes. I stop them for jaywalking, or I pop them for something else, and then I pressure them to tell me about the cigarettes they have in their pocket, right? At the end of the day, here we are making a policy decision based upon emotion. And it's going to be disastrous for the Black community. We need to be aware of these types of policies that are being put in place. It's already statewide in Massachusetts. We have it in San Francisco. We have somewhat of it in Oakland. New York City has been trying to do it. We've been pushing back at it time and time again. We've been able to make some difference. Black police and Latino police organizations are coming out in opposition to it and trying to fight this. But unfortunately, most people don't understand the nexus between banning the sale of menthol cigarettes and an increased police presence. So as we go forward, we need to really place an emphasis on public policy. I think that this is a time, unfortunately, when we're dealing with the deaths of so many Black men and women at the hands of the police, and now we're starting to get some traction on police reform, we can't forget about public policy. This is a time for us to undo the war on drugs. This is a time for us to undo the prohibition of all drugs, right? This is a time to push back against future policy, Kwasi, like you mentioned, like we're talking about dealing with menthol cigarettes. I sure hope today, and let me just say this, the main mission behind the group that is starting this, the main mission is to prohibit all tobacco. Can you imagine what would happen if this country prohibited the sale of all tobacco products? We'd be right back where we started back in the 1930s, 20s, and 30s with Harry Anslinger and cocaine and heroin and marijuana. While Paul says there's a lot more to what's happening with the menthol tobacco bans, but it's definitely something we can't allow to happen. We have to continue with a health focus, an educational focus, a treatment focus regarding tobacco, and we'll continue that downward trend of people smoking cigarettes. And also with that, they're also making this attempt, they're going after vaping. And that was part of the whole vaping problem that we're dealing with. They are connected, they're definitely connected. And so we got to be mindful of this stuff, and we got to do whatever we can to prevent it from happening.
Thank you, Neill. It's evident that this is an ever-evolving problem. And, we've been able to talk a little bit about some specific things that are happening, and I kind of want to move a little bit more into a meta conversation. We've got about 5-7 minutes left. So I kind of want to pose a question out to you guys. How do you feel spiritual bypassing is involved with all of this?
I'll speak to that a little bit. So I find, especially a lot in doing this harm reduction type of work, spiritual bypassing for, people who may not know is basically just trying to avoid dealing with sort of a negative aspect of things and kind of always keeping things in this positive light and on this like spiritual level. And what I noticed with a lot of people, we've been talking a lot, like largely on a systemic level of how things are, from colonization and, dealing with the racism and the structural parts of our system, but not so much in the interpersonal parts of our system. I feel like spiritual bypassing comes a lot from a lot of white people or sometimes, white adjacent type folks, and having these conversations about anything that's uncomfortable. It can be about racism, it can be about the drug war, it can be about things that are not particularly comfortable for people to do. And there's this particular illustration or graphic that I like to reference a lot that people can find online. That's called the Pyramid of White Supremacy. And it talks a lot about how there's different types of like microaggressions and language that people use to sort of like avoid these types of uncomfortable conversations or avoid addressing these biases that they have within themselves. It's like a form of minimization or even just like changing the subject. And it's very difficult to have conversations. You know, I do a lot of education around drug use. I do a lot of education around just, you know, taking care of yourself with however people are choosing to use drugs. And that tends to come up a lot. And I'm even sort of seeing it in some of the chat, which, you know, it's moving very rapidly, but there's people also like policing the way that people use drugs. And a lot of people attach this like very, like this extremely spiritual context, or like, you know, this appeal to nature that you have to use substances in a very specific way. And I think that's very exclusive for a lot of groups of folks, especially given that the way that we have access to a lot of substances here are very much not going to be in their natural form. And their natural form is illegal, you know. So, you know, I wanted to make people aware of that that's sort of a form of bias, and that is a form of, you know, it can be racist. So it becomes very uncomfortable for me to have these conversations with people, especially, well, not for me, I'll talk about it all day. For them, it's very uncomfortable because a lot of the spaces that I'm doing this work in are predominantly white, just because that's just the nature of a lot of entertainment right now, especially when it's like cost prohibitive for a lot of people of color. You know, Black and brown people may not be able to afford a $300 festival. People are like, for some reason, like mystified why there aren't a lot of Black people at Burning Man, you know? So I'm not even gonna go off on that tangent, but I really wanted to talk about how that is a form of just avoiding these uncomfortable conversations, and really dismissing the experience that a lot of Black and brown people have with their type of drug use. And Camille might have a little bit more to add to that as well.
Thanks, Mohawk. I love talking about spiritual bypassing. Yeah, something that struck me, I was talking with Mike, who's doing tech behind the scenes. Thank you, Mike, for bringing us together. Was this amazing documentary series by Adam Curtis called The Century of the Self. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It's on YouTube. And it spans a lot of interconnected issues. But I think in the second episode, it focuses on the human development movement, and sort of focusing on how the Vietnam War anti-war movement was co-opted in this period, and sort of those folks within the Vietnam movement sort of became very embedded into the capitalist system in a different way that was quite shiny, and, you know, about sort of expressing your individuality through capitalism. And the human development movement was arguably a big part of this. And there's some incredible footage of some folks at Esalen in the 60s having an argument with some folks from the Black Panther Party. The folks at Esalen are saying, you know, this focus on race, you're just causing issues for yourself. You just need to let go, man. Everything's going to be fine once you let go of this. And the Black Panthers are quite rightly saying, you have no idea what you're talking about. You have no idea. You know, the level of, they didn't use the word privilege. I don't think that was being used in the vernacular at the time. They're basically saying, you know, you're being incredibly privileged. And it just strikes me as interesting, or slightly sad, that over 50 years later, we're still kind of having the same conversation in a lot of spiritual or, you know, or even psychedelic communities, that this is such a dominant argument, this idea that we are all one. And so even talking about the issue, even talking about the construction of racism somehow creates more of it. And as we know from harm reduction or from sex education, when you educate and understand about something, it doesn't cause more of it. It actually allows you to make informed choices. And I think that's what we need to do, not talk about race as a belief that this thing is real. We know it's socially and politically constructed. We know this current incarnation of racism is only about 400, 500 years old. And it can really be tied to, you know, what was happening with the transatlantic slave trade and different groups of indentured laborers coming together, you know, in class solidarity to kind of try and overthrow the elites, the plantation owners. And they thought, you know what's really a good idea is we should allow white people, or people we're going to name as white, to feel that they have more power and agency now. And so this is a great way to divide the group struggle here that otherwise would threaten our economic power. So we know that race isn't biologically real, but as a social construction, it has huge impacts on the lives of people in various parts of the world. And we're not going to move past that unless the system is acknowledged to exist and that we have a good grip on how we all are complicit in reproducing it in some way, especially when we're not conscious of it. So there's a lot to unlearn and to unpick. But I think spiritual bypassing can be very frustrating because it just shuts down the conversation. As Mohawk was saying, it stops us from even being able to talk about it, let alone take action around healing, creating reciprocity, and just more care. Because racism has, really, if I think about it from an embodied and interpersonal level, it's about deep dehumanization and lack of care and lack of empathy. There is currently an empathy gap. Not going to say for, hashtag not all white people, but as a generalization, the fact that you still have people on the internet suggesting that Rashad Brooks and, even George Floyd somehow deserved to die because they were criminals. I mean, where do you think that comes from? Deep lack of empathy and intergenerational dehumanization. And that's been facilitated by drug laws that makes you think that, a black man who's got drugs, criminal, degenerate. But if you watch Breaking Bad and you see someone who's making crystal meth that's white and a family man, you can feel empathy for that person and that family. So it kind of just drives home the indoctrination and the layers that we kind of have to collectively reckon with. That these drug policies and histories of colonization have really allowed us to stop seeing a lot of people as fully human. And that's what we need to shift. So there is a level of needing to talk about that and then work on an embodied level to kind of undo that. Because it is bigger than the United States. This is a global issue. And even the drug war itself has been exported to so many different countries with the same kind of racialized tone. And, the US often won't give foreign aid to different countries unless they implement the same kind of draconian drug war policies. So growing up in the UK, it's very stark that you see that actually for the percentage of our population, we incarcerate a higher percentage of our Afro-Caribbean population than you'll do in the US. And Black people get criminalized at a much higher rate for just personal possession of cannabis. I think it's 11.8 times the rate than white people in terms of convictions for cannabis. And that's data from Release, who, if you're interested in the UK context, are the kind of Centre for Expertise on Drugs Law in the UK. So, this is a global issue. And I think the US does have a big piece of the puzzle to kind of reckon with, especially with the president that you have right now and the impacts that has everywhere. So we really urge people to engage with this more deeply. There's a lot to learn. As I say, I'm still learning, unlearning. But I think we do have to reckon with it and not just bypass it, because otherwise it might be another 50, 60 years that we still seem to be having this conversation rather than using this moment as an opportunity for closeness and connection and reconciliation, which is what can happen if we go through the discomfort and acknowledge the harms that have been caused and the ancestral trauma that's been bandied around for a long time.
Beautiful, beautiful. My heart's like beating so hard right now. Something that you said is sticking out to me about this, sort of ancestral trauma. And so there's a woman, a Native woman called Ramona Beltran, and she says that we have intergenerational trauma, but we also have intergenerational wisdom. And we've talked a lot about, a lot of the harms that communities of color and Native folks have gone through due to colonialism, drug policies, the list goes on and on. And so as we have this conversation, I also want you to think about the things that give communities of color strength, right? And think about the wisdom that they have to bring to the world. And before I sort of segue into bringing some questions out from our chat here, I wanted to pose that question to you and thinking about how we can think more about intergenerational wisdom. And so if you guys would like, feel free to start shooting some questions into this chat. We've got about 25 more minutes. And so our panel is going to be happy to answer some questions for you all. And so one of the questions that came up before, and we can start here as you guys start putting your questions out, was what does psychedelic reciprocity look like?
I'd love to jump in on this a little bit, but I'll make it short. I think psychedelic reciprocity, I think, is going to be a process. I don't think it's a final destination. I think it's going to be about rebalancing care and agency to indigenous communities and medicine holders of specific plants. I think it looks like acknowledging people like Maria Sabina, who is responsible for the world knowing about magic mushrooms because of a very exploitative interaction with a white Western man who she trusted to bring into ceremony on the condition that he wouldn't share the information with the world. He goes back to the West and publicizes a big article, about the medicine ritual she was doing. And, she had a little bit of a tragic story after that. I think it's about acknowledging these medicine holders and how we can support the not just survival but thriving of indigenous communities and their relationship with their plants, and also building into policy a means for the communities who have been impacted by colonization and disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs to have access to healing through psychedelic therapies, whether that's clinics who have low cost or free spaces, always a percentage available to POC communities or indigenous communities, and really building that into how we shape the movement, and also really advocating for cultivation, for home cultivation. We cannot let the corporatization of this movement mean that there are patents and people can't even be in relationship with growing their medicine, using their medicine. So I think those are a few things we can consider, but there's a lot more. And I think we also need more indigenous perspectives at the table shaping the debate and the context, instead of what feels like quite closed conversations that have so far led us to where we are in the psychedelics movement.
Thank you so much, Camille. I'm going to jump here into the questions. We have a question here that's really speaking to a lot of the conversation that we're seeing in media. And this question is, what does police abolition mean for addressing the drug war?
Well, I'll chime in a little bit here. I think that's a great vision to have, police abolition. I personally believe that it can be done, but it's going to take a lot. It's going to take a lot of us in community showing that we can and demonstrating that we can do what's needed among ourselves so that we no longer need the police, right? And I know that there's a lot of work already being done in this area. For instance, there are communities that have put processes in place to deal with the things that happen in community, to deal with arguments, restorative justice type models, to squash disagreements, right? We're seeing a lot of this in our schools begin, and this is where I think it needs to begin, because we need to get the next generation to the point where they can manage differences among themselves, right? Teach them how to do this. So with our young people, if we can get them to effectively deal with anger, to effectively deal with disagreement, to effectively deal with challenges, then there won't be a need for the police if we can do this. But we're going to have to change a generation or two to get this done. And right now, it does begin with defunding the police. And when I say defunding the police, we're not just talking about taking money away from the police. We're talking about taking those resources and putting them to the needs that are out there, right? Nutrition, health, mental health, education, housing. There's a long list of things. I'm all for it, but where I'm challenged is that we know that there are people and groups, to say within the United States, there are people, there are individuals, and there are groups of people who make it a mission in life to go after and hurt other people. I mean, we're seeing this with this administration, right? the, the most dangerous terrorist groups in this country are homegrown in this country. Right? There are people from within this country that want to go after and seriously hurt other people and other groups of people. How do we manage that? And we're going to have to figure out how we manage people who truly want to inflict harms on other people. You know, who's going to deal with that? Who's going to conduct the investigations? How will they be conducted? How will you hold those people accountable? How will you go after those people to hold them accountable when they don't want to be held accountable? I know there's a way to do it. I don't know what that is or what it looks like, but we can begin the process. And I think we have begun the process of shifting those resources strategically into those important places within our community so that we can effectively improve public safety for the long term. The police are only and can only be at times a short-term resolution for some violence. If we want to do it long term, we've got to do the work in our neighborhoods and in our households and in our communities, and we need resources to do that. And the criminal justice community, policing, the courts, and corrections have a lot of resources that we can move. So I believe we're on the path to police abolition, but we got a long way to go, folks, and it's going to take a lot of work, a lot of work.
Thank you so much, Neill. The next question that I'm going to pose, I think is really important because it's centered around action, of the individual. And so this is a person who says that they'd like to work collectively with others to expand disintention and movement in their communities. They want to take action and they'd like to work with others. And so the question they ask is, in what ways can we as people of color mobilize to create opportunities for education to our communities about the awareness of safety and the awareness of the benefits of sacred medicine plants?
That's a very there's not like a really short answer to that question, I guess. I mean, there's a lot of, I see that there's a lot of this already happening in different like small groups and in like different levels. I think it also depends on your community, but as a person who is educating on drugs like virtually every single day, I think there are probably already a lot of people out there doing something like this, and a lot of people are just not aware of it. I would just invite people to try to do some research, ask some friends of theirs. There's a lot of representation of like folks in different psychedelic societies in this chat. Find these groups. I think there's a lot of this type of education already happening. It's just not being highlighted just because the current negative narrative for psychedelic research and psychedelics use is very whitewashed. And so, people seem to interpret that there's like no people of color doing this work when this is a panel full of people of color. We're all Black and we're all here, we're out here. So look into us, look up other resources. As I promised that once you kind of like get integrated into those networks, you'll find a lot more. And then maybe you'll be able to find, oh, there's this need that needs to be met. Like there's all these other groups doing this, this, and this, but maybe not quite this. So, I'm going to help maybe fulfill that need. But I assure you there's like someone that lives very close to me who is a Black shaman who does ayahuasca ceremonies in Brooklyn. Like these people are around. So, I think that connecting with them first would be a good start.
And I'll also add a little bit of this to one of the things that was important for me when I went to the MDMA Therapist of Color training program when I was coming back home, was figuring out how can we bring this medicine to the communities that need it the most. And so when I was asking myself that question, the answer that kept coming up was, first, how can we bring mental health into these communities that need it the most. And we recognize that there are so many layers of stigma that are preventing people from accessing these services, but not just the stigma, but there's also all of these barriers that include insurance and access. And so when you're thinking about how we can bring psychedelic medicines into these communities, I want you to pair it too with how we can bring all of these very necessary resources along with them. Specific to the psychedelics, I think what's important is that when we talk about psychedelics and sacred medicines, we are reclaiming them as people of color. And so if you have that conversation with people, make sure that you're letting them know that this belongs to you, right? And so bring in that cultural context, because I think white America has colonized, if you will, psychedelics, right? And so it's about reshaping that narrative. And so looking at it as a way that we can bring in those cultural roots to reframe it as something that does belong to us. And then, of course, always remembering to think about the other pieces that are super important to including mental health, including access, general access, including insurance, right? All of these different pieces. Consider all of those when you're thinking about how we can bring these medicines into those communities. And so the next question that I want to ask is really important, because there are a lot of organizations and a lot of conversation that's developing around this. And the question is, what are your thoughts on how capitalism affects the perception and legalization of psychedelics?
Actually, that was a question I was going to ask the rest of the panelists too. So that's a great question, because it's not just about psychedelics. We're seeing it with marijuana reform. We're seeing it as a prohibition problem, period. I mean, I personally believe it. That's the reason that prohibition is lasting and existing so long. Just think about the pharmaceutical industry. But I'll pause there and let other panelists talk about that. I want to hear more about that.
I feel quite concerned, I suppose, about the impact that capitalism in this current economic moment that we're in is having on the blossoming psychedelic renaissance, as I guess we're calling it again, for a number of reasons. I think that capitalism is not really invested in healing people in a holistic way. It's generally most interested in labor and exploiting resource for the benefit of a smaller group of people. So it's not going to be economically in the interests of people trying to sell certain experiences or patent certain entheogens or substances to allow home cultivation necessarily, or to allow people to have access to medicines in their traditional ways. If this is a commodity, which is looking more and more to be the case, then my concern is that it will not be about healing the majority of people who need it, but about creating profit for a smaller group. I also feel that there's not enough harm reduction in the mainstream right now. We're in this moment where psychedelics are kind of trending and they're everywhere. And there's, as Kwasi was saying, very little conversation around mental health, even though to me it's like such a dominant piece, because many people, understand they have trauma that often is connected with different mental health experiences. And then, we have now the presentation of psychedelics as if it's this magic pill that just heals all of these things, which I think is particularly harmful for communities of color who have, as we've already talked about, higher rates of trauma, more complex trauma often because of systemic oppression and ongoing racial trauma. And then the dynamic where, if you're a Black person or POC, it's very challenging to even find a therapist who shares your racial identity or even acknowledges that race-based trauma is a thing. So even accessing healing modalities is already more challenging for many folks of color, or global majority folks, I like to refer to us. Feels a bit more empowering. So I think that, I personally don't have a lot of trust that capitalism in and of itself will deliver equity and access in the way that I dream of equity and access kind of being woven into access of entheogens. And I think we have to be aware of that and think about, again, what care looks like outside of shareholder value, and how we can use this moment to really imagine more beautiful possibilities, and not just have this approach of like, just legalize it and all be fine. Because as we've seen with cannabis, It's not the case. If you're really invested in this benefiting people in the mainstream, then we need to be very mindful about how this is rolled out and have more of a civil society action-based approach to be mindful of how this is emerging. I guess one more thing I'd say about mental health as well is, whenever I've presented on at conferences around psychedelics, inevitably someone asks me about schizophrenia. In the UK context anyway, African heritage people, Afro-Caribbean peoples, disproportionately affected with giving a diagnosis for schizophrenia. So I know that myself and many other people are very interested in understanding, how psychedelic therapies and just therapeutic mental health approaches in general can actually begin to treat this and, again, care for people more broadly, especially as schizophrenia is such a politicized condition. There's really amazing information if you're interested in looking at COINTELPRO, which are declassified CIA documents from the time when they were heavily surveilling the Black Power movement. And you'll see in those documents that Malcolm X and many other Black Panther members were referred to as paranoid schizophrenics. So during the civil rights movement, this is really the transition where suddenly schizophrenia became associated with Black people, and a way to actually, again, kind of bypass the content and the liberation struggles that people were having and fighting for, to kind of demonize them and to sort of pathologize them. So again, there's a really interwoven history with racism and this, and we also see that even further back with one of the first ever mental health diagnoses, which was drapetomania. And this was a condition supposedly given, they said that when enslaved people were trying to run away, they have drapetomania. They're ill, they have drapetomania. So I think we also need to really look at the mental health institution or mental health industrial complex and how that has worked with capitalism and racism to continue to pathologize and oppress certain groups of people. And that has to be part of the conversation if we're going to consider what psychedelic healing and equity looks like for communities who've been targeted by that.
Thank you, Camille. One of the questions that I'm looking at here speaks a little bit to some of the things that you were talking about as far as looking at a redesign of, what our political systems look like, or rather our drug policies look like. And so the question here is, does the future of drug policy reform involve completely getting rid of the schedule system? Are there ideas for entirely new systems of drug regulation, or is reforming the current system more ideal?
I will start by saying that, I can't really speak to like what's better as far as the path that we should take, as far as like changing the way that drug policy exists right now. But I will say that a lot of the avenues that exist right now for rescheduling substances, or decriminalizing certain substances is actually extremely challenging. A lot of people don't understand the political process around this, especially when we're talking about the federal political process, which is why we have a lot more progress state by state, because states can basically, override a lot of laws in each individual state based on, their populations. So it'd be great to throw out the whole scheduling system, because it's obviously based on complete BS. It's completely inconsistent. It doesn't make any sense as far as like claiming that things have no medicinal purpose, or are like highly addictive and things of that nature, when we all know that that's not true in a lot of cases. And like Camille had mentioned before, like this disproportionate type of punishment between drugs that may be of the same class, or even the exact same pharmacological structure, crack and cocaine being enforced differently. Or even just like, the medicinal regulated form of something versus the, illicit version of that. So I think, in an ideal world, if, there was like some really awesome president who just wanted to come in and be like, all right, we're doing away with this. Like, they maintain powers to do something like that. I don't think we'll see anything close to that anytime in the future. the FDA process, for getting things rescheduled for like medicinal use is extremely long and tedious. So like the avenues that we have right now are just not great for much progress at all on a federal level. And I just wanted to point that out because a lot of people don't understand that. And I don't know if like Neill or someone else wants to speak more to what.
Yeah. My view on a scheduling system is, first of all, at the very least, for any natural plant, should be completely removed from any scheduling system, period. For the other stuff, I just think it's about full disclosure. What is it? What is it made of? What does it consist of? What will it do? What are the side effects? Just full disclosure about what it is and what you're faced with if you use it. Education's the key. As we heard before, when you prohibit these things, and which is part of the scheduling system, the lower the number, the more restrictive it becomes, and that it is, and that's when these drugs become problematic for people to use. So basically, full disclosure, what it is, what it does, maybe some really good advice. Somehow, I don't know what that looks like on how to use it. I love, for those of you who know Eric Sterling, I really like how he puts it. Eric Sterling talks about having a trip counselor when you're using different drugs, someone who can guide you through the use and make sure that you're doing so in the safest possible way. But the bottom line with me is any natural plant should not be a part to any scheduling system.
We've got time for just one more question. We've got about 3 minutes left of this. And so the last question that I want to pose is one that's getting a lot of attention right now. And so it's a comment on this question, and it says, what responsibility do we play to indigenous communities who are the originators and keepers of ayahuasca ceremonies? How can we center their needs versus that of ours?
Can you actually repeat that question for me, Kwasi?
So the question is, what responsibility do we play to indigenous communities who are the originators and keepers of ayahuasca ceremonies? How can we center their needs versus that of ours?
I feel like listening to their needs and desires would be a good start. And many Indigenous communities have been sharing their views around the clinical trials involving ayahuasca and saying they do not want this, that it isn't respectful to their tradition, and that to try and chemically synthesize what is seen as a spirit teacher is disrespectful. I don't want to speak on behalf of communities, so I'd encourage people to particularly look at the work Shakruna are doing in giving platform, one of the more mainstream platforms anyway, to hearing some of these perspectives and voices. But what I consistently see in the medicalization of the psychedelics field is that it's been the sense of, well, we need to use the science to get things through. So even though we might sort of give attention to this, we're just going to full steam ahead just to kind of get legalization or decrim without giving attention to the nuance or the people who may have different opinions and different needs. And I think we need to shift that, because that in itself is a legacy of colonialism. This sense that Western scientific rationalism is the priority, is up here, is superior, and that all other ways of knowing and being in the world are inferior. We massively need to shift this logic. Otherwise, we are still in a colonial way of thinking and operating. I don't know what that looks like in a scientific context, or what that would look like in the context of clinical trials, because, the medical industrial complex, as I've alluded to, is so embedded in these kind of colonial processes. But I think it is important to really center the needs and the voices and different perspectives of different Indigenous communities, and also the struggles that they have outside of anything to do with plant medicine, but to do with oil companies, the ongoing genocide that many communities experience because of logging, because of their homes being destroyed and having to be displaced. So if we really are going to celebrate certain cultural aspects that Indigenous communities hold, in my opinion, reciprocity looks like being in solidarity with them to be able to live on their terms and the way they want to live. So it's a much bigger piece than just around plant medicines or entheogens, but really, how do we operate in solidarity and give care and thanks in action to support these communities to thrive rather than simply survive, which many of them are not doing at this rate. And in the context of COVID too, many Indigenous communities have been massively impacted, dying at disproportionate rates, as well as obviously African American communities and also Afro-Caribbean folks in the UK. Funnily not on the continent. Most Africans on the continent are actually fine. Disproportionately, we see the biggest impacts of COVID really happening in the West, and particularly communities of colors in those countries, which is, again, I think due to systemic inequality, due to colonization. But yeah, I think we should be listening more and really reframing who gets to dominate the conversation and what the intentions are and how we start to demonstrate care in action rather than just in words and platitudes.
Thank you so much, Camille. And thank you so much, Neill. Thank you so much, Mohawk. That was amazing. I learned so much from all of you. Something was shared with me by Mike earlier, something that's been kind of floating around the internet. And I sort of wanted to end this just by reading it to you all. And it says, "It's no accident that you learned about Helen Keller instead of W.E.B. Du Bois. You learned about the Watts and the L.A. riots, but not Tulsa or Wilmington. You learned that George Washington's dentures were made from wood rather than the teeth from slaves. You learned about Black ghettos, but not about Black Wall Street. You learned about the New Deal, but not redlining. You learned about Tommy Smith's fist in the air in the 1968 Olympics, but not that he was sent home the next day and stripped of his medals. You learned about Black crime, but white criminals were never lumped together and discussed in terms of their race. You learned about states' rights as a cause of the Civil War, but not that slavery was mentioned 80 times in the Articles of Cessation. Privilege is having history rewritten so that you don't have to acknowledge uncomfortable facts. Racism is perpetuated by people who refuse to learn or acknowledge this reality. You have a choice. And you guys have made that choice in part by being here today, having the intention to learn, having the intention to build your empathy, and having the intention to do something. And so I want you guys to thank yourselves. I want to thank you all for being here. In a couple of weeks, July 4th weekend, we're going to have a conversation on collective liberation and intersectional solidarity, and I hope to see you all there.